Great to be chatting again with the member for Mallee, also the Shadow Assistant Minister for Regional Development, Dr. Anne Webster. How are you, Anne?
I'm very good, thank you, Ricky. How are you?
Oh, well, thanks. Look, I could say the Albanese government's days are numbered, at least the parliaments are, but they're not numbered as many as you'd like.
No, absolutely not. So much for not wasting a day in government. Let's remember that's what was stated. In actual fact, we've done a tally on the number of weeks that we have left in the year, and we've got the Parliamentary Library to provide the information to us, and we have the fifth lowest number of sitting days since Federation and the lowest number of sitting days since World War II. I mean, seriously. What kind of accountability can opposition, which is our role, what kind of accountability can we hold the Albanese government to when we have so many crises it's hard to number them all, but we have an energy crisis, we've had floods, we have COVID management, we have national security issues, we have foot and mouth disease, we have Varroa mite. We want to know what the government is doing, and we need to be able to ask them the appropriate questions to hold them to account.
Well, no less, there's also a federal budget, an unusual sort of second budget in a calendar year happening because the new government wants to reset the budget papers in October, isn't it?
That's right. That's exactly right. So one of the weeks is actually budget week. So in point of fact, we even have less number of sitting days where we can ask the questions in Parliament that the government should be prepared to answer.
So it just sounds from what you're saying there that there's a bit of stage management going on. You've got the Prime Minister going overseas representing Australia on the world stage, and then just limited number of sitting days to face scrutiny, but they can put all of their big ticket items in their recast budget.
Well, that's exactly right. How can you see it another way? There are inevitably there are some of these trips that the Prime Minister has taken are important for the country. But when you have so many crises, I mean, and he's not answering any of the questions about these crises when he's overseas. He's not going to answer Australian questions.
How does that research from the Parliamentary Library you've got to hand there, how does the coalition government say in its last term measure up in terms of number of sitting days compared to what's scheduled for 2022?
Well, the reality is that we only have the lowest number of sitting days. That's what I asked for, within the years where we have had the lowest number of sitting days. And it is pretty striking that since 1939, in fact, since 1920, they're in a bit of a hodgepodge because they are different days. For example, 1925 is the next lowest. So 67 days in that year. This year we will have 74. The next highest is 1940 in the middle of World War II, has 77 days.
So just for the listeners' benefit, I think this comes up from time to time, they sort of expect that federal parliamentarians almost work full-time in Canberra. Why do we have so few of the working year in Canberra itself? There's a constituent business to do in your electorate.
That's right, exactly. Normally, we balance the time in the electorate. Obviously, I've got a very large electorate, so it takes quite a bit of my time. Now, as the Assistant Shadow Minister for Regional Development, that takes in all of Australia. And interestingly, under the Albanese dollar-saving measures, I have no staff, no additional staff to do that. So that's going to be a serious challenge. We need to be able to balance the work that we're doing in the electorate, the representation, hearing from the community. That is what we take back to Canberra. And so it's actually, I think it's a very good system. We take back the voices of our communities to Canberra and have the debates and present the issues in Parliament.
All right, well, I guess for those that are happy to see you around the electorate more, they might see an upside in that one, Anne. But we'll move along to one of those topics that you mentioned before about Varroa mite. Biosecurity is a big concern. There's a lot of debate going on about the foot and mouth disease and what treatment, if any, should be applied to travellers coming back from Bali or Indonesia. But Varroa mite is also this concern for our bee industry and, for instance, in Sunraysia, a big challenge for our almond growers.
Absolutely. I spoke several weeks ago to Darren Minter, who was on the almond board, and the issue is that we don't have enough hives, and yet we have hives on the other side of the river in New South Wales that are not allowed to be brought in. Here we go again. Who knew that the border issue would come up again? Now, at the moment, Varroa mite, from my understanding, the intel that I have, is that it's contained around Newcastle. Fair enough. It is very serious and we don't need to have it spread anywhere. But in Sunraysia, we have 15,000 hives within eyesight of Victoria, and yet they can't come across. That is a very, very big problem for the almond industry. It will be a problem ongoing for citrus and for every other harvest that relies on pollination, and most of them do. So,
I saw a press statement from Agriculture Victoria, I reckon it was pretty late last week, maybe Friday, saying they're going to allow South Australian and Queensland apiarists to bring their hives in. I imagine Queensland will have to come through New South Wales to get the hives in the first place, but isn't South Australia going to be preoccupied with their own harvest needs?
Well, of course. And can you not be logical, please, about bringing beehives from Queensland through to Victoria? There just needs to be common sense with these issues, and we just don't have it. I'm not sure what Murray Watt, the Minister for Agriculture, is doing. We have an $80 billion industry in terms of foot and mouth disease, and he's throwing $17 million at it. And even that is not going to be stopping people when they come into Australia and throwing out shoes. I mean, there are some very logical solutions. You're coming from Bali, wear thongs, throw them in the bin, and walk through a footbath on the way through and put a new pair of thongs on.
We've certainly seen some innovative approaches. National Farmers Federation have formed some sort of funding deal, I think, with Ringers Western. You get a 30% discount if you show on social media you've thrown out your thongs. But if there's an upside to this one, always looking for an upside here, and maybe making travellers aware when they come back from countries there are biosecurity issues they're creating for our farmers. Maybe that's what we need, is even better messaging at our airports.
Look, I'm sure that is true, but as I heard somebody commentating last night, a lot of the people who are going to Bali are much younger and, paying attention to the kind of devastation that will occur. I'm not sure what kind of messaging would necessarily get through. I think we need firmer measures than that.
Well, maybe even something about the animal welfare side of how horrible it is for an animal to have foot and mouth disease. Maybe that'll get through to the younger generation.
Well, and the fact that they're going to have to be destroyed. I remember as a young adult seeing scenes in England on television, obviously, where entire herds were incinerated. It was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. We do not need that kind of awful scenario happening in Australia.
It would absolutely beg a belief to see something during such a wet and non-drought period, when usually you associate that sort of action being needed in a drought. Let's just talk about telehealth for a moment here. We have had a response from Minister Butler on this issue last week. They say that you can still have a video consult if you're in remote Australia or regional Australia, and in remote areas you can still have a telephone consult for over 20 minutes if it's considered clinically appropriate. But is that enough with these changes to the Medicare funding that the government's brought in?
No, look, I don't think it is. And what concerns me is that the extension for this, I believe, is to September. I may have that wrong, but I believe it's through to September. Theoretically, the end of this COVID wave. But the problem is that we have a lot of older folk who live out in the regions who don't necessarily have a handle on technology. So while it might be a flick of a switch to most, it's not necessarily so. I know people who still have flip Nokia phones from, I don't know when they were even created.
I feel nostalgic about those myself.
Oh, that's nice. But the fact is you can't do FaceTime on them. And not only that, connectivity is a serious issue. It remains an issue in many places. On top of that, we have COVID as an ongoing issue, flu as an ongoing issue. Older folk, people who are vulnerable, don't need to sit in doctors' waiting areas. potentially able to catch COVID in the waiting room when they could do a consult on the phone.
So what we're talking about here with the Medicare funding arrangement is that the government, in its own wisdom, has said that you can have a 20-minute or longer consult with your doctor funded by Medicare if it's via video, but not via telephone in regional settings. But when you consider the connectivity issues you've just mentioned, some people are going to find it hard to maintain a video link for that long in regional Australia.
Oh, without question. There's nothing like talking to a frozen screen with a specialist or a GP on the other side. My husband's a GP. He says it's not necessary to have to look at a person when you are discussing things like their medication sheet. Some people are taking complex medications that need to be carefully reviewed in order that they are not going to have a poor interaction, particularly when talking about antivirals. But whenever you add a medication to somebody's list, the doctor needs to be able to spend time talking about whether the patient is taking these other medications or whether they've stopped taking them. Just because they're on the list doesn't mean people are taking them. So there is a lot of time that is taken to ensure people's safety and best health practice. To have an arbitrary 20-minute cut-off is it's just not sensible.
Well, it just seems odd to us as well from the Minister's response. He said, Mark Butler, that 6 out of 7 consults are under 20 minutes. That seems like a utilitarian sort of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few approach when health is rarely about, the utilitarian view. It's about saving as many lives as possible.
Oh, look, absolutely. And health is individual. There's no question about that. I'm not sure where he got his 6 out of 7. I think it probably depends on the practice and depends on the doctor concerned as to how long they take with patients. Nobody wants to be considered a number and pushed through in a consult finished at 20 minutes because that's the time. Individual health needs must be taken into consideration, and doctors need to be free to practice appropriately with integrity in the work that they do.
Well, I guess in the absence of a parliament sitting, you've got the media here to be able to raise these issues if you can't raise them in Canberra, Anne.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Ricky, because, the population need to be able to consider what's really going on. There's an announcement made and the minister concerned is confident that this will be, look at Chris Bowen this week, for goodness sake, with regard to energy and some of the statements that he has made. It's just literally fluff and nonsense. And there needs to be consideration and questions asked about what it really means.
Absolutely, Anne. We will take up that topic, I think, next time we talk. Thanks for joining us today on Flow.
Very happy to be with you. Thanks, Ricky.